Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to the second lecture of the induction week for the neurosurgery curriculum for Mansoura Manchester Medical Education Program. I am Mohammed Shirbini, and in this lecture of neurosurgery, and in this lecture, we will cover briefly the basic applied neuroanatomy knowledge that you should know during the neurosurgery course. In this lecture, we will cover briefly the anatomy of the cerebral cortex, cerebellum, brainstem, uh, the ventricles and CSF circulation, circular wills as the basic blood supply of the brain, anatomy of the cella, and briefly we'll cover the vertebral column and spinal cord. Of course, in each lecture later, you will have more detailed anatomy specific to the topic. Starting at the medial surface of the cerebrum, you can recognize at the center there is a corpus callosum, which is a type of the commissural fibers, which connects the two cerebral hemispheres. It bounds the forms the superior part of the lateral ventricle. Superior to the corpus callosum, you can see the cingulate gyrus, which is part of the limbic system, responsible for emotion processing and behavior regulation. And superior to the cingulate gyrus, you can notice the paracentral lobule, which is responsible for the voluntary motor movements in the lower limbs and uh, bladder control. Posteriorly, you can notice two sulci, the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and the calcarine sulcus, which is side of the area 19 for which is the primary visual area. Also, you can notice the tentorium, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum and part of the brainstem inferiorly. And here is a summary of the important landmarks you can notice on the medial surface of the cerebral cortex. The medial surface of the cerebral cortex is a seat of many of the Brodmann's areas. Uh, Anatomically, the frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by the central sulcus, while the sylvian fissure separates the temporal lobe from both frontal and parietal lobes. The frontal lobe contains the primary motor cortex, area 4, and also associated motor cortex, area 8, which is responsible for conjugate eye movement in the superior frontal gyrus. The Broca's area also is located in the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe, just behind the central sulcus, is a seat of the areas 1 to 3, the primary sensory areas, and the occipital lobe contains, of course, the primary visual cortex and the visual associated areas 17 and 18. The temporal lobe contains the vernix area, which is speech association area, and the auditory cortex. And here you can review the anatomical landmarks and the Brodmann's areas for each lobe regarding the lateral surface. The inferior surface of the cerebrum is related anteriorly to the anterior and middle cranial fossa, while posteriorly it's related and resting on the tint, which is the dural fold, as you know. Adherent to the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, you can see the olfactory nerve, and in between the two frontal lobes, when you separate them immediately in the midline, there is the genu of the corpus callosum. Anterior to the midbrain and the cerebral peduncles, we can notice the optic and pituitary systems, which we'll discuss later in the anatomy of the cella. Here we can review the important structures and anatomical landmarks of the inferior surface of the cerebrum. The posterior fossa is occupied by the cerebellum and brainstem. brainstem anteriorly and cerebellum posteriorly. The cavity of the hindbrain is the fourth ventricle, which is located between cerebellum, roughly or grossly located between cerebellum and pons and medulla anteriorly. The roof of the fourth ventricle is attached to the cerebellum and it is called medullary velum. The superior medullary velum and the inferior medullary velum together form the roof of the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is in continuity superiorly with the aqueduct of Sylvius, which is the cavity of the midbrain, and inferiorly to the central canal of the lower part of the medulla, and then which is in continuity with the central canal of the spinal cord in the cervical region, of course. Here we can see the anatomical relationship of the anterior surface of the brainstem. The most superior part is formed by what's called tegmentum, which is the anterior half of the midbrain, and it's also called the crus cerebri. And the oculomotor nerve exits in the midline in the pontum zincephalic fissure. The trochlear nerve exits on the posterior surface of the brainstem and winds anteriorly along that fissure, also the pontum zincephalic fissure. Lateral part of the pons, the trigeminal nerve exits, and we can see, as we can see in the diagram, the facial and the vestibulocochlear nerves exit in the junction between pons and medulla, and the lower nerves exit at the lateral border of the medulla oblongata. Here we can review the anatomical landmarks and functional anatomy of the ventral or anterior surface of the brainstem. As you can see here, the dorsal surface of the brainstem. Anatomically, the most upper part is the midbrain part, and it's formed of four bulbs, as you can see, which lie immediately under the pineal body. And these bulbs together are called tectum. They are the two superior and two inferior colliculi. As we mentioned earlier, the trochlear nerve exits at the dorsal surface and winds around the pontum zincephalic fissure to pass anteriorly, and the dorsal part of the dorsal surface of the pons forms the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle, and the medulla posteriorly is divided into two parts: open medulla superiorly and closed medulla inferiorly. The floor of the fourth ventricle is formed the upper part by the posterior surface of the pons, and the lower part by the open medulla, uh, which forms the lower half of the floor of the fourth ventricle. Important anatomical landmarks here is what's called facial colliculus, which is formed by the nucleus of the abducent nerve with facial fibers around it, and it's in the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle in the pontine part, and the stria medullaris separates the two halves, and in the lower half, which is medullary part, we can see the hypoglossal and facial nuclei. Here also in this table we have summarized the important landmarks and structures of the posterior surface of the brainstem. The cerebellum is divided anatomically by the primary sulcus and the posterolateral sulcus into three lobes, which are the anterior and posterior and the folliculonodular lobe. While functionally it's divided into three zones according to medial to lateral orientation. The most medial part or median part is called the vermis, while just lateral to it is the paracentral, and the most lateral part is called the lateral hemisphere. Functionally, it's related to the medial to lateral orientation. The most lateral part was the largest part and called the lateral hemisphere is connected to the cerebrum, and it's responsible for coordination and planning of all of the voluntary movement. and that's why it's called cerebrocerebellum. While the vermis and the para median parts are connected to the spinal cord and they are together called spinocerebellum, while the folliculonodular lobe is mainly associated with the vestibular system. That's why it's called vestibulocerebellum. The cerebrospinal fluid is located inside the cranial cavity in two main sites. The first site, of course, is the ventricular system, and the second site is the subarachnoid spaces, which is further divided into cisterns, which provide anatomical landmarks during surgery. Production of CSF takes place within the choroid plexus, which is present in the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, and fourth ventricle. The circulation starts in the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle via foramen of Monroe, and then via the aqueduct of Sylvius to the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, it exits the ventricular system via foramen of Ruschke and Magendie into the subarachnoid spaces, which supplies CSF to the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord, and the rest of CSF circulates to be absorbed in the arachnoid villi, which are present in the superior sagittal sinus. It's important to understand the circulation of the CSF because obstruction of any of these sites will lead to hydrocephalus, which is further divided into communicating, which is non-obstructive, or obstructive hydrocephalus, according to the site of obstruction. As we mentioned, the subarachnoid space during the CSF circulation, we should revise the coverings of the brain. The brain is covered by three layers. The first layer is called the outermost layer is called dura mater, and it's further divided into two layers: outer tough and fibrous layer and inner layer. The dura mater is adherent to the inner surface of the skull, and between the dura mater and the arachnoid there is a subdural space, which is the site of subdural hematoma, either acute or chronic. It carries the bridging veins, which, if injured, leads to chronic subdural hematoma. The second layer is the arachnoid, which is thin layer. It's thinner than the dura, but still tougher than the pia. And the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid and the pia, which is totally adherent to the brain surface, is very important. As we mentioned, it's the anatomical landmark for all of the circle of Willis, and all the vasculature of the brain runs through the subarachnoid space. So any vascular surgery should be done within this arachnoid space. Also, it's divided anatomically into cisterns, which provide anatomical landmarks during surgery and provide a source of CSF drainage during surgery to allow some relaxation of the brain. Here you can review a summary for the previously illustrated points regarding the ventricular system, CSF production, and circulation. The arterial supply of the brain occurs via what's called circle of Willis. The circle of Willis, as we can see in the diagram, is divided into anterior circulation and posterior circulation. The anterior circulation is formed by the internal carotid artery, which is one of the two terminal branches of the common carotid artery. It ascends in the neck without giving any branches, and then divides inside the cranial cavity into anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery. The two anterior cerebral arteries are connected via the anterior communicating artery, while the common carotid itself is connected to the posterior cerebral artery via the posterior communicating artery. The posterior circulation is formed by the vertebrobasilar system, where there is one vertebral artery on each side, and both vertebral arteries fuse at the level of the bones to give one basilar artery, which further divides into two terminal branches, which are the two posterior cerebral arteries. And as I have just mentioned, the posterior cerebral arteries are connected to the anterior circulation via the posterior communicating artery. Understanding this anatomy is very important to understand all the vascular lesions of the brain, as well as the surgery of the vascular structures, as all these arteries are seats of what's called cerebral aneurysms, of course, of different incidence and occurrence. The cavernous sinus is one of the dural venous sinuses. It's present on each side, just lateral to the pituitary gland. Very important to understand the anatomical relationship of the cavernous sinus, either to the pituitary gland, optic chiasm, which lies just superior to the pituitary gland, and the internal carotid artery, which runs inside the cavernous sinus, as well as other neural structures which run either inside the cavernous sinus or in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, like the tracheal nerve, abducent nerve, premotor nerve, and the ophthalmic and maxillary divisions of the trigeminal nerve. Also, it's important to know that the cavernous sinus is connected to a dangerous area in the face, which is illustrated as a triangular area in the diagram, as there is venous connection and shared venous drainage between this area and the cavernous sinus, which allows or makes this area infection in this area susceptible to intracranial spread. The pituitary gland is formed of two lobes, the anterior lobe and posterior lobe. The posterior lobe is called the neurohypophysis because it is embryologically driven from the hypothalamus, and the hormones of the posterior pituitary are just stored in the posterior pituitary gland. They are sensitized in the hypothalamus and stored in the axons of the secreting cells in the posterior pituitary gland, which are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones. These hormones are under neural regulation of the hypothalamus, while hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, also known as adenohypophysis, they are under chemical control from the hypothalamus. The releasing hormones and depressing hormones are sensitized into the hypothalamus and transferred via sinusoidal circulation from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, like the prolactin, the growth hormone, the LH, FSH, and ACTH, and TSH. All these hormones are under stimulatory effect except for prolactin, which is under inhibitory effect. That's why a tumor that's compressing the pituitary stalk leads to increase in the serum prolactin level. Also, it's important to understand the anatomical relationship we mentioned earlier in the previous slide between the pituitary gland and the optic chiasm, because lesions in the pituitary gland will compress the optic chiasm and maybe the patient only present to be presented with visual field defect or visual deterioration up to visual loss and optic atrophy. All cranial nerves are important in neurosurgical practice, but here we will give a brief idea about the cranial nerve lesions that we encounter very usually during our practice. As we have just mentioned that pituitary tumors or cellular tumors generally and all anterior cranial fossa tumors would compress and affect the optic nerve. We all know that the optic nerve is formed by the nasal fibers and temporal fibers. The nasal fibers, which are medial, and they receive the temporal part of the field due to reflection at the lens, while the temporal fibers receive the nasal part of the field. The optic nerve is formed by both nasal and temporal fibers of the same side, while in the in the optic chiasm, the nasal fibers decussate to cross to the other side, while the temporal fibers pass undecussated. And after distal to the chiasm, there is what's called optic tract, which is formed by the temporal fibers of the same side and nasal fibers of the opposite side. The optic tract relay at the lateral geniculate body, and from there it projects to the primary visual cortex. It's also important to understand one of the most important reflexes for in neurosurgical practice, which is the pupillary light reflex, which is nucleus is Edinger-Westphal nucleus located in the midbrain. The extraocular muscles are supplied by the third, fourth, and sixth nerves. The superior rectus, medial rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique are supplied by the oculomotor nerve, while the superior oblique is supplied by the trochlear nerve, and lateral rectus supplied by the sixth nerve, which is the abducent nerve. The facial nerve has a complex anatomy as it exits the brainstem and it enters into the internal auditory canal, where, in relation to the middle ear, it has the genu or the geniculate ganglion, which is the site of exit of greater petrosal nerve. Then the facial nerve continues within the bone to exit the skull via the stylomastoid foramen, and in the face it divides into the five terminal branches: temporal branch, zygomatic branch, buccal branch, and mandibular branch. These branches are all muscular and responsible for the muscles of facial expression. It's also important to know that the facial nucleus is divided into upper part and lower part. The upper part is bilaterally innervated from the cerebral cortex. That's why we can easily differentiate clinically between the upper motor neuron lesion, which involves only the lower half of the face, as the upper half of the nucleus is bilaterally innervated, and the lower motor neuron facial, which affects the whole side of the face because it occurs after the nucleus. The eighth nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is responsible for hearing and equilibrium. Receptors of this nerve are cochlea for hearing, utricle, saccule, and semicircular canals for equilibrium. Both nerves, the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve, both exit the internal auditory canal to course within also the subarachnoid space in the cerebellopontine angle to the brainstem. As we revised briefly some of the important anatomical landmarks for the cranial anatomy, we will now revise some also anatomical landmarks of the anatomy of the spine and vertebral column. The vertebral column is divided into three regions: the cervical region, which is formed of seven vertebrae, which together make a lordotic curve, and the dorsal or thoracic region, which is formed of 12 vertebrae, which together make a kyphotic curve, and the lumbar region, which is 5 vertebrae, make a lordotic curve again. And distal to the lumbar vertebrae, we can see the sacrum, which is fused together, and the coccyx, which is also fused together and attached to the sacrum. Internally, we can see the same linings, the same coverings of the brain are extended here into the spinal cord, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the biomater, which is adherent and attached to the spinal cord. At some points, this biomater is thickened and provides what's called dentate ligaments, which are uh, ligaments extending laterally from the spinal cord to fix it and attach it to the dura laterally to fix it in its place. And also the most terminal part of the bia is thickened and called filum terminal, which is attached to the tip and the lower end of the spinal cord. First, we start cranially by the atlantoaxial joint, which is a pivot type joint, and it's a typical joint between the vertebrae, where the axis, which is C2, has an upward extension called the odontoid process or dens, and this process articulates with the anterior part of the cavity of the C1, the atlas vertebra, which also is a typical cervical vertebra. This joint is limited posteriorly by the transverse ligament and the tip of the Odontoid process is attached to the base of the skull via what's called alar ligament. The transverse ligament with the longitudinal ligament form what's called the cruciate ligament of the atlantoaxial joint. The anatomy of the typical vertebrae is similar between the regions, cervical, dorsal, and lumbar regions, but with different proportions and shape of the vertebrae. The typical vertebra is formed of anterior part, which is the body, and it occupies nearly the anterior half or anterior two-thirds. And there's the cavity in the center of the vertebra, which is called spinal canal or vertebral foramen, through which the spinal cord passes till the level of L1, where the spinal cord ends and the coda equina takes place. The typical vertebrae articulate to each other via what's called facet joint, as the superior articular facet of one vertebra articulates with the inferior articular facet of the vertebra above, and so on down the spinal cord. Posterior to the lateral on each side of the spinal canal, there is the pedicle, and posterior to the spinal canal, you can see two lamina, one lamina on each side, which fuse to form the spinous process, and there are lateral projections, as you can see here in the diagram, which is the transverse process. Still illustrating the typical vertebra, as we can see here in this diagram, this is an axial view of the vertebra with the neural structure relationship. As we can see the spinal cord in the center and the nerve roots exiting laterally and on both sides. It's important to understand this anatomical relationship, as some of the spinal lesions may compress these structures, like the herniated intervertebral disc, which is, if in the cervical region, would compress the nerve root and the spinal cord, and if in the lumbar region, after the end of the spinal cord distal to inferior to L1, it will compress the nerve roots while they are exiting the neural foramen. Unlike the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, the spinal cord is reversed regarding the orientation of white matter and gray matter. The gray matter is the the inner layer, and the white matter is the outer layer. As we all know that the gray matter is formed of the nuclei of the neurons, which are arranged into 9 lamina, as we can see here in the famous H-shaped gray matter of the spinal cord, while the outer layer is the axons of the ascending and descending tracts from and to the spinal cord and then to peripheral nerves. I wish in this lecture we have covered most of the basic applied neuroanatomy knowledge that you will need during this neurosurgical course. Thank you for your listening, and any questions should be left down in the comments or could be asked personally during the live session for this lecture. Thanks again, and I wish you good luck.